The night Rome learned daughters could be claimed on a winter night in 39 AD, Rome did not sleep, because sleep required the illusion of safety. And that illusion had just been taken away, as lanterns wrapped in red cloth moved through narrow streets like wounds that refused to close, stopping before certain doors while others were spared without explanation. And inside those homes, fathers held their breath, mothers pressed hands to mouths, and daughters learned that silence could be louder than screams, because the knock did not come as a threat, but as a command, delivered by guards who did not shout or argue, who entered homes as if the marble of the Palatine already stretched beneath their boots, carrying scrolls sealed in imperial purple that turned private houses into extensions of the palace. And when the seal was broken, the words inside were brief, merciless, and irreversible, summoning a daughter not for trial, not for marriage, not for service, but for presence. A word so vague, it denied the family even the dignity of understanding. And this was how Flavia's name left her home, spoken softly by her mother, as if the walls themselves might be listening, while her father smiled, a practiced smile, meant to show loyalty to a power that could end him with a gesture. Because in Rome refusal was not courage, it was suicide, and obedience was not safety, it was delay. And the city knew this, even if it refused to say it aloud, because the emperor was Caligula, and Caligula had begun to look at Rome not as a people, but as a body to be tested, stretched, and cut open to see how much pain it could endure before it broke. And yet the terror did not arrive as chaos or fire, but as ritual, polished, orderly, and deceptively beautiful, with girls escorted through torchlit corridors into a secluded wing of the palace known as the Garden of Venus, a name chosen not to honor the goddess, but to mock her, where pink marble glowed under oil lamps, silk curtains breathed perfume into the air, and servants spoke in whispers learned from fear, not reverence. And here the daughters of Rome were bathed, dressed, adorned with gold so heavy it bent their necks, told they had been chosen, told this was an honor, told the emperor wished to see them, and each lie was wrapped carefully enough to feel believable, at least for a moment, until the doors closed and the city vanished behind stone walls. Because what the girls did not yet understand was that the garden was not a place, but a process, designed to strip identity slowly, to replace memory with compliance, to turn noble blood into something owned, measured, and consumed. And as Flavia stood beneath painted ceilings that told stories of love and gods who punished mortals for defiance, she felt the first shift inside herself, the sense that whatever waited beyond this night was worse than the fear she already knew. Because Rome had not summoned her to serve its emperor, it had offered her as proof that no family, no lineage, and no innocence stood above the will of a man who believed himself untouchable. And somewhere deeper within the palace, behind doors no map recorded, Caligula was preparing to show Rome exactly what that belief would cost. The childhood that taught an emperor how to destroy long before the Garden of Venus took its first breath, long before Flavia's name was lifted from her home and carried into the palace. The machinery that would consume her had already been assembled inside a child. Because Caligula was not born mad, he was trained by fear, shaped by loss, and educated by survival in a world where affection was a weakness and trust a fatal mistake, growing up as the son of Germanicus, Rome's most beloved general, a man adored by soldiers and civilians alike, whose shadow was so large that even emperors feared it. And for a brief, fragile moment, Caligula's life appeared blessed, surrounded by loyalty, honor, and the promise of greatness. Yet that promise curdled almost overnight when Germanicus died under circumstances so suspicious that Rome whispered poison even when walls were listening. And suddenly, the golden child became a liability, his family dismantled piece by Emperor Tiberius, exiled, imprisoned, executed, erased, until Caligula learned the first rule that would govern his life. Love invites destruction, and survival demands silence, a lesson carved deeper when he was sent to Capri, the island retreat of Tiberius, where Rome imagined an old emperor resting in peace, while, Behind closed doors, power fermented into something grotesque, because Capri was not a school for governance. It was a laboratory of control, where Caligula watched men disappear after careless words, where laughter could be interpreted as treason, where smiles were weapons and obedience was armor. And for 6 years, he lived beside the man who had destroyed his bloodline, perfecting the art of appearing harmless, learning to bow without bending inside, learning that power does not need to justify itself. It only needs to endure. And when Tiberius finally died, and the Senate elevated Caligula to the throne, Rome celebrated with an almost desperate joy, believing the son of Germanicus would heal the wounds left by a paranoid tyrant. And for a short while, he played the role beautifully, releasing prisoners, abolishing hated taxes, staging games so lavish they felt like forgiveness made flesh. Yet beneath the generosity something brittle was cracking, because when illness struck him late in his first year as emperor, pushing his body to the edge of death, it did not soften him, it stripped him. And when he rose from that bed, Rome saw a man who no longer believed in restraint, no longer feared consequence, no longer recognized limits. And standing above the city that worshipped him, Caligula reached a conclusion that would define everything that followed, that if the gods had allowed him to survive while others perished, that he himself must be divine. And divinity does not ask permission, it takes. And it was here, in this moment of absolute certainty, that women of noble blood ceased to exist in his mind as daughters or wives and became symbols, tools through which he could rewrite Rome's unspoken contract between ruler and ruled. Because if the most protected could be violated without resistance, then no one was safe. And somewhere within the palace, plans began to form, rituals disguised as privilege, cruelty dressed as ceremony. And while Rome applauded its emperor, unaware of the shift that had just occurred, Flavia and girls like her continued their lives believing history was something that happened in books, not something that would soon reach through their doors and claim them next. A palace ritual Rome erased from memory. The Garden of Venus was never announced, never debated, and never written into law, because Caligula understood something older than Rome itself, that the most effective crimes are those disguised as tradition. And so the ritual did not arrive with chains or blood at first, but with choreography, with whispered instructions, measured steps, and rules that sounded almost sacred, as the girls were told they had been selected for a private imperial observance meant to honor the fertility of Rome and the favor of the gods. A story carefully crafted to quiet panic and replace it with confusion, because confusion delays resistance, and resistance was the one thing this ritual could not allow. And inside the garden, the daughters of senators and generals were kept apart from the world, cut off from family, time, and even names, addressed instead by attendants who spoke in rehearsed gentleness, reminding them that silence was expected, obedience rewarded, and fear unnecessary, while marble halls echoed softly with music meant to soothe, though it only sharpened the sense that something was wrong, because nothing here was spontaneous. Not the baths, not the garments, not even the smiles of the servants, all of whom understood that a single misstep could place them beside the girls they were preparing. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rules tightened, conversations were restricted, doors locked more often, and the jewelry placed upon the girls grew heavier, collars disguised as adornment, marking each body as property of the state. And this was when the truth began to surface, not in declarations, but in absence, as one girl vanished and did not return, then another. And explanations were offered in tones too calm to be believed, claiming reassignment, illness, divine calling, words so vague they dissolved under scrutiny, yet no one dared challenge them, because outside the palace families waited in enforced ignorance, knowing that asking questions was itself an accusation. And within the garden, Flavia learned that the ritual was not a single event, but a cycle, a procession of nights during which Caligula would observe, select, and discard, reducing human lives to moments of amusement, asserting dominance not through public spectacle, but through secrecy, because secrecy multiplied terror, allowing rumors to travel faster than truth. And it was here that ancient authors would later hesitate, where records grew thin and descriptions fractured, because even men hardened by war recoiled from writing what they knew, disguising references behind metaphors and euphemisms, calling the garden a place of excess rather than naming it for what it was, a system of sanctioned violation engineered to remind Rome that its emperor could reach into the most guarded homes and leave nothing behind but silence. And as Flavia stood beneath statues of goddesses carved to embody purity and love, she understood the final cruelty of the ritual, that it did not only harm the body, but corrupted meaning itself, turning symbols of beauty into instruments of fear, religion into justification, and honor into bait. And while the city above continued its markets and games, pretending not to notice the daughters who no longer walked its streets, Caligula perfected his creation, confident that time, shame, and power would erase the garden from memory, never imagining that centuries later historians would begin to notice the gaps, the sudden disappearances, the coded complaints, and realize that Rome had not forgotten because it did not know, but because remembering was more dangerous than silence. When beauty became a political weapon, by the time Rome began to sense that something unnatural was unfolding behind the marble walls of the Palatine, Caligula had already refined the Garden of Venus into an instrument far more dangerous than raw cruelty, because what he was building was not chaos, but leverage, a system where beauty itself became currency, and the daughters of powerful families were transformed into silent hostages whose suffering ensured obedience long after they vanished from public view. As senators learned that loyalty was no longer proven by speeches or votes, but by how willingly they surrendered what they loved most, and Caligula watched closely, noting who hesitated, who trembled, and who complied too easily, because each reaction revealed a weakness to be exploited later. And this was how the ritual crossed from personal depravity into political strategy. As noble women were no longer chosen at random, but selected with intention, their lineage studied, their marriages calculated, their absence engineered to fracture alliances and soften resistance, turning private agony into public control. And inside the garden, the rules hardened accordingly, with girls instructed not only in silence but in performance, taught how to walk, how to look down, how to present themselves as offerings rather than individuals. Because Caligula understood that humiliation was more effective when it appeared voluntary, and this illusion of consent allowed the court to continue functioning without open rebellion. As fathers attended Senate meetings beside men who knew exactly what had been taken from them, yet could say nothing, because to speak was to condemn their remaining family. And so Rome's elite became complicit in their own erasure, bound together by shared guilt and fear, while Caligula reveled in the knowledge that the most powerful city in the world was governed by men who could not protect their own children. And Flavia began to see the deeper design behind her captivity, realizing that she was not imprisoned because she was weak, but because she was valuable, her body a message delivered directly into the heart of Rome's ruling class. And this message was unmistakable, that under Caligula, tradition meant nothing, law meant nothing, and bloodlines that once shaped the empire could be bent or broken at his whim. And yet the most insidious aspect of the garden was how thoroughly it erased its victims afterward, because those who survived were returned altered, bound by threats never written down, their marriages rearranged, their voices dulled by shame imposed from above, while others simply disappeared into the folds of history, leaving behind gaps that later writers would gloss over with vague accusations of excess or madness, unwilling to confront the truth that Rome's institutions had not failed suddenly, but had been hollowed out slowly through fear disguised as privilege. And as Caligula expanded the ritual, embedding it deeper into the machinery of power, he grew confident that no force within the empire could stop him, believing that by weaponizing beauty, intimacy, and honor, he had discovered a form of domination more absolute than legions or laws, unaware that this very system, built on silence and terror, was planting the seeds of a reckoning that even an emperor could not ultimately escape. Why no family dared to speak afterward. Silence became Rome's true language, not the kind enforced by guards or decrees, but the deeper, more durable silence that settles into people when fear has proven itself reliable. Because after the Garden of Venus tightened its grip, families learned that survival depended not on innocence, but on forgetting. And forgetting had to be performed convincingly, as senators returned to public life, pretending their households were intact, their smiles steady, their loyalty unquestioned, while inside their villas' rooms remained empty, garments untouched, and names avoided, as if speaking them aloud might summon the emperor's attention once more. And Caligula understood this psychology perfectly, because terror that leaves no visible wound spreads farther and lasts longer than violence openly displayed. And so he allowed the ritual to remain officially invisible, encouraging rumors without confirming them, letting uncertainty do the work of enforcement. And this uncertainty fractured Rome's social fabric. As families stopped trusting one another, unsure who might report hesitation, who might offer a daughter too quickly, who might already be compromised. And within this atmosphere, the garden no longer needed constant use to function, because its reputation alone was enough to discipline the elite, and those who had endured it carried its weight silently, returned to society, altered by experiences they could not name, bound by threats delivered privately, reminders that their families still existed at the emperor's pleasure. And for some, the silence was maintained through marriages, arranged with unnatural haste, alliances reshuffled to conceal disgrace, while others were absorbed into religious roles or distant estates where their absence raised fewer questions. And the city accepted these explanations, because accepting them was safer than probing further. And even historians of the time chose caution, writing around the truth rather than into it, describing Caligula's reign with words like excess, decadence, and madness, labels that blurred intention and minimized accountability, because to document the garden directly would have implicated not only the emperor, but every institution that enabled him. And this was Caligula's greatest triumph, that he transformed individual suffering into collective complicity, ensuring that each family's silence reinforced the next, creating a network of unspoken agreements that no one dared break. And Flavia came to understand that her pain was not meant to be remembered, only to be useful, a temporary pressure applied to bend Rome's spine. And yet, beneath the surface, this enforced quiet began to rot the empire from within, as resentment fermented behind obedience, and whispers traveled through servants' corridors, bathhouses, and marketplaces. Fragments of truth passed carefully from mouth to ear, never complete enough to form an accusation, but sufficient to build a shared dread. And Caligula sensed this shift even as he dismissed it, mistaking the absence of protest for submission, unaware that silence can also be preparation. And as the garden's influence spread beyond the palace into every corner of elite life, Rome approached a breaking point where fear alone could no longer hold what loyalty once had. And somewhere in the city, among men who had lost daughters and women who had lost themselves, a dangerous realization began to take shape, that an emperor who ruled through secrecy could be undone by exposure, and that what had been hidden so carefully might yet find a way into the light. The truth historians were never meant to uncover Caligula, believed that time would finish what fear had begun, that the Garden of Venus would dissolve into rumor, then myth, and finally nothing at all, because empires often survive by burying what shuns them. And for centuries it almost worked, as later writers reduced his reign to madness, caricature and spectacle, focusing on theatrical cruelty, while skirting the quieter systems that made such cruelty possible. Yet history has a way of betraying its suppressors, not through grand confessions, but through inconsistencies, gaps and patterns that refuse to align, and modern historians began to notice them. The sudden disappearance of noble women, recorded only in family trees that ended without explanation, the abrupt political realignments following private summons to the palace, the ancient texts that spoke nervously of unmentionable excesses without daring to define them. And when these fragments were placed beside one another, a darker structure emerged, revealing that Caligula's terror was not random insanity, but an organized strategy rooted in control, humiliation, and ritualized power. And this realization forces a more uncomfortable conclusion, that Rome did not fall silent because it was ignorant, but because it understood too well the cost of speaking. And the garden was not merely the product of one man's cruelty, but the mirror held up to an empire willing to trade its daughters for stability, its morality for survival, and its memory for peace. And in this light, Caligula's assassination appears not as the triumph of justice, but as a desperate correction, an attempt by Rome's elite to excise a symptom without confronting the disease. Because the structures that enabled the garden did not vanish with him, they adapted, refined, and continued in subtler forms under later rulers. And this is why the truth remained buried for so long, because to fully expose it would mean admitting that civilization itself can become an accomplice when fear outweighs conscience. And Flavia's story, and the stories of countless others like her, were never meant to be told, not because they lacked importance, but because they threatened the comforting narrative that Rome was undone only by madness, not by choices made daily by ordinary people protecting themselves. And as the last traces of the garden are pieced together from ruins, marginal notes, and the words ancient authors dared not finish, the final horror becomes clear, that what Caligula did was not worse than death because it ended lives, but because it taught an entire society to live with the unbearable, to normalize the unthinkable, and to survive by pretending it never happened, leaving us with a question that history cannot answer for us, only pose whether we would have spoken, or whether, like Rome, we too would have chosen silence and allowed the garden to bloom unseen.